Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your panel on Mentoring and Motivating the Next Generation of Leaders, moderated by President and Chief Operating Officer of the Milken Institute, Richard Ditizio.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I'm thrilled that it's a packed house to hear about this topic. So this is part of our equality track here at the conference, and hopefully you've noticed that we've put a concerted effort in this year. This panel is particularly focusing on leadership and developing leaders for the next generation. I think I'd like to start by giving a little bit of the difference in words that we're going to use. Like there's mentor and sponsor and ally tend to be the words that we use around this subject, so I want to make sure we're clear on that. So for this purpose, mentor is going to be someone that you can go to for advice, somebody that you can be yourself with and also receive some critical feedback. So a cheerleader that's in your corner, but also objectively looking at your career, your choices, and giving you honest feedback, even when the feedback is a little painful. A sponsor inside an organization is someone who, at a significantly higher level than the mentee, and can actually do something to advance your career in a proactive way. And an ally is someone who can be a peer that comes from a very different demographic group than you do, but creates a support network laterally across the organization. Each of those is changing dramatically. So when I started in banking 30 plus years ago, you would meet people who were celebrating their 40th, 50th anniversary oftentimes, because people would join an organization and stay there for most of their career. Today, that's totally upended. And people who are graduating college today, the estimate is they will have 7 different careers. Not be at 7 different banks if you're in financial services, do actually 7 different things over the entirety of their work life. And as that demographic changes, who's entering the workplace, reflecting back the demographic changes that are occurring in America and around the world, and this notion of geography starts to dissipate through advances in technology and people are communicating across borders, we have to change how we think about leading, because it's going to be far different in the future. So I want everyone, close your eyes for a second and picture a large bank CEO. Now, how many people pictured an older white guy? Okay. And I think that since mostly older white guys are leading firms, I think less than 2% of global banks are led even by women today, even less people of color. So you can see that if you were entering an organization and you didn't fit that mode and you look up top, you might be thinking, how am I ever going to get there? And I think that we need to focus at the earliest of stages to change what people's expectation about what their career can be. So we are fortunate, Ndaba Mandela is here, Nelson Mandela's grandson, and I think he's speaking on a panel if you haven't seen it. He was speaking last night at a dinner I attended, and he was talking about, he hadn't met his grandfather for much of his early life, and when he did, he asked him, what is the thing you missed most about being in prison for so long? And Nelson Mandela answered, I never heard the sound of children, and therefore I never had a glimpse into the future. So I think that children are a pretty good place to start. And I'll start our discussion by turning to you, Beth, because you lead LIDA. And there's a saying that talent is evenly distributed, but opportunity is not. So why don't you talk briefly about what LIDA does, and then give me some ideas around your strategies to empower the kids.
Thank you, Rich. So I'm the Executive Director of Leadership Enterprise for Diverse America, also known as LIDA. We're an organization that is dedicated to bringing more diversity to the leadership sectors of this country and making sure that those who lead truly represent our nation's citizenry. We support talented students from around the country, from low-income backgrounds, to gain admission to and succeed at our most nation's selective colleges and position them for competitive careers. Mentoring and role modeling is a key component of the work that we do, demonstrated by the fact that just for the past 2 years, 70% of our students were admitted to the Ivy League schools, Stanford and MIT. And for those of us who have kids who are going through the college process or so forth, we know what a feat that can be. And that just shows that there is a demand for diverse talent in this country, but you have to recognize it in different ways. For our students, they're really striving to lead in places where the pathway to leadership has been gated by resources, in these very elite colleges, in these corporate headquarters. And for them, the opportunity to have a role model, someone who looks like them, from a similar background than them, with whom they can talk honestly, being vulnerable, ask questions, is a key component of being able to navigate these spaces of privilege. I can share one anecdote of a young man from a big urban school district in New Jersey, went through Princeton University, went and became a paralegal at a top New York City law firm, and then found his way to a competitive law school. About a month in, he showed up in my office and he said, Ms. Breger, actually he called me Beth, finally now that he's an adult, he said, Beth, I don't think I can do this. He said, I do not belong in this place. I am not prepared. And this is a young man who went to Princeton, mind you. And we connected him with an older student, an older Lita scholar, who's now a lawyer at a top firm. They spent some time talking, and this older mentor kind of told him that what he was feeling was normal. He validated it. He heard him ask those questions that were embarrassing and that he was scared to ask. And he came back to me a couple weeks later, and he said that made all the difference in the world, having someone that he could connect with in that way. So, mentorship is a form of social capital, and those who are in these privileged spaces and go to these top institutions, they often take social capital for granted. So if you're coming from a background that is under-resourced, having someone who can mentor you and help you build your own social capital can be quite transformative.
Mm-hmm. And how many kids go through LIDA each year?
We add about 100 students a year. We've served 1,000 so far. We have students who are now young adults, about 30 years old. About half of them have pursued graduate degrees. We have a whole posse of lawyers and bankers. Our students have been hired from many of the firms who are sponsored in this room. But we also find that our work on the career pathway is also about working with our employer partners to show that you can look at talent in many different ways. It may not look one color, one shape, or one size. Talent can come through with grit and determination, other kind of non-cognitive abilities.
So 100. We run a program here at the Institute in concert with the IFC where we take about 20 to 25 people from various African nations in their finance ministries and bring them to the US for a year to train them on capital market development. So that means after 3 years, which we've done now, we have about 70 people who've gone through it. So David, I want to turn to you because I know that you have just announced the 20 Civic Innovator Fellows at the Obama Foundation. These numbers, while terrific, are small. So how do you think about getting to scale? Because it's so critical to move the needle quicker. And do you have any anecdotes or ideas at the early stages of the foundation of how you're going to do that and judge its success?
So beginning, Rich, with a mission, the former president said, I don't want to spend the post-presidency focusing on specific issues. What I want to do and what Mrs. Obama wants to do is to identify, empower, and then connect the largest global network of impactful change makers ever assembled on the planet. For a guy named Barack Obama, you would expect an audacious vision, and then he said, so guys, figure it out. So over the past 2 years, we essentially looked at the civic leadership continuum. And we disaggregated across a number of skill sets that people have when they engage as civic leaders. And again, our focus is essentially on a notion of citizenship that isn't just about what my rights are, which frankly is a very consumptive view of where I fit in a society, but what my responsibilities are, not just to myself, but to my community. Once we did the analysis of the different component parts, we said, okay, can we structure in very small scale programs that meet people where they are? The fellows that we announced today, we have 22,000 applications for 20 people. Good news and bad news, right? Huge pool. The president said, then what are we going to do with the other 21,980? And what we are intending to do over the course of the next 3 to 4 years is essentially drill down on our measures of efficacy for each one of these. As we're doing that, we're also building a shared platform so that the 20 fellows connect with 150 community leadership core young people in Chicago, who then connect with 150 in Hartford, who are then connected with the 150 in Phoenix and in Columbia, South Carolina, who are connected with the 200 Obama African leaders that convened last year in Johannesburg, each one of them at different stages of leadership. So now what you have after 5 years are verticals that are fully developed, where we've really drilled down on efficacy, and now we can begin to transition to a notion of scale and sustainability. The thing that has been the most impactful, that I think gives me the most ambition, that fits into this discussion today, essentially is the young man in Uganda who is teaching empowerment around chess. And he essentially just started a very small chess club in his village, and he's bringing in young men and young women and helping them develop. At the Obama Foundation Summit last year, he met a young woman from East Asia who was doing girls' empowerment around what she called freedom cups, where she said that girls were being inhibited from going to school because of menstruation. She developed a program around it. They spent an hour together, and all of a sudden, without any prompting from us, all we did was connect them and give them some basics. She is in Uganda developing that Freedom Cup program there, and he is about to go then to her nation and begin to develop leadership development around chess. And so when you see these little anecdotes of people at different stages from different parts of the world who are all connected with this notion of building up their community and themselves, you can begin to see at scale how this can turn into the type of impact that the President and Mrs. Obama envisioned.
So Joel, following up on this notion of creating networks as part of your dispersion of finding mentors and creating scale. So you, as the chairman of JetBlue, but also you're a professor, you spend time with young people. Do you think that the schools today are arming young students with those type of navigational skills to create their own networks? And what should organizations like Stanford or like other for-profit organizations be doing to train kids along that way?
Let me just say, in response to the two people on the end, the scale of their operations is really impressive. So I teach a leadership class at Stanford where I have 60 young people. And these are the most capable people. It's the hardest graduate seat to get in America. And we bring in Arianna Huffington and Alan Mulally and Carly Fiorina, and Jim Mattis, people like that. And they spend an hour and a half with them, and they can ask them any question that they want to ask them. And the thing these 60 amazing students say is, I didn't understand anything about leadership. I didn't realize it was so multivariant. There were so many different kinds. There's so many different ways to lead. So to me, the main thing that you do is you expose people. I think mentorship is all about having an example in front of you. You know, if somebody can show you how to do it, there's nothing more powerful than the show me thing. So what I've tried to do with my life, it's one of the reasons I've taught for 27 years at Stanford, is because you can influence people by showing them things. Now, I can't achieve the scale these guys are doing, but I can touch a life at a time. And so that's how I've chosen to do it.
So Kevin, you're an investor. A lot of the learning comes from failure.
Right.
So people learn when things don't go wrong, how to recalibrate, and that's often where the lessons are. But how do you balance the need for people to learn from their mistakes and grow, and giving them the space to do so, with preserving your capital as an investor and wanting the greatest return in the quickest way possible?
Yeah, that is a good question. You know, when I think back, in the context of mentorship, for me, falls into the internship programs I've been involved in for 25 years in various businesses. If you went back to the early 90s, when I would say to a manager, look, we're going to bring in 4 or 5 interns this summer. We're going to put them with you. They were really miserable about that. They'd said, look, I'm not going to get any value in what I have to do within this organization spending my time training people that are not going to stay with me or have any vested interest in pursuing my goals. These were the honest managers saying, look, this is a burden for me. That has changed so much today where, you know, in the next few weeks, I'm going to hire a lot of interns to do a lot of due diligence for a lot of companies all across America, because we're going to tape Shark Tank again, and we're going to have 100 companies that has to get due diligence done on them. And the difference now is, and what I like about the analogy is this, I've gone to a different model. I've looked at what the Swiss have done. I love the apprenticeship program in Switzerland, where companies make long-term commitments to individuals in that country, small companies, large companies, Nestle, you name it. If you find a talented individual that you think over the next 5 years, as they go through their high school schooling and then do their military and then come back into the workforce, that you think you'd like to invest in that person as a true mentor, to help them develop a career as a leader in an organization and give back to it hundredfold, the amount of attachment to that model is huge. And you're picking up these kids in high school. Now, I like that. I like that idea a lot, and I like it for all my companies. And I've just, stealing from what the Swiss have figured out, they don't call it an internship. It's a commitment to an individual for a long period of time. Sometimes there's remuneration involved, sometimes not. Sometimes they pay for their education. Whatever, you work that out with the family. But you're committed to this individual and this team for the long haul. And they know that, and the amount of productivity that comes from that is unbelievable. It is a competitive weapon, and that should be the new model in America as far as I'm concerned, in the context of business. But I see no reason why it can't be done in nonprofits and other social agendas. I mean, it's a longer-term commitment. It's somewhere where that individual knows it's not just a summer job. It's my life, and I'm getting a remarkable path, that a unique opportunity, someone that's willing to invest in me through good, bad, and an ugly, a marriage. The great analogy is a marriage. And we're trying that across a lot of companies. I love engineers. I love business students tied to law. That's where I focus, because we have a lot of logistics problems in these nascent companies. The average size is probably 10 million in sales, so they need help. But if they find a talented individual, they'll commit a tremendous amount of resources to them. That's different, and I think it's a great idea for our domestic companies. Sorry about the Swiss. I'm not paying them a royalty for it.
No, I think that's great, and I think that embedding that in a culture, that notion of investing in the future talent, I think it goes back to what I said earlier. When people were thinking about their careers in 40-year slugs, you had a responsibility to invest in the younger talent. It was part of the culture of the organization. I think that has drastically gone down. So Joel, when you've actually written a book on culture and trust, so what do you think corporations can do, given this now fleeting time frame with which they have employees? How can they establish a culture that values passing on a value system and knowledge to the next generation of talent?
Well, they start out, I think, by thinking about every single person in the organization wants to be a respected member of a winning team doing something meaningful. And so I think as a leader, you have a responsibility to think about what is meaningful, and then how can you win? And in business, that means that you grow profitably. And how can you make them part of that, make them a respected member of that? And it starts out with building high trust. High trust relationships are the thermonuclear fuel of building great enterprises. And so if you can figure out how to, and the book that I wrote is called The 10 Laws of Trust, and its fundamental thesis is that you can be intentional about building a high trust culture. And I found that young people respond to that. They want to be able to trust. And by the way, people trust you when you deliver on promises. That's the most basic thing, but so many people don't really deliver on promises. We're in a world where people finesse things, they spin, they don't really tell the truth completely. So I think it's actually, as a leader, you have a real opportunity to be a meaningful mentor, just behaving, just doing what you learned at your mother's knee. It's incredibly powerful. And young people respond to it like crazy.
Mm-hmm. And I think, I want to go to you, Beth, because I know that often you're pairing people who come from less advantaged backgrounds, and the people who need to help them sometimes come from more advantaged backgrounds. So there's this notion of the imposter syndrome. So talk a little bit about that and how kids respond.
Right, so our students talk about a phenomenon called imposter syndrome. It's that, to give you an example, a young man who was admitted to a very top tier institution, had gotten straight A's all his life, did his first semester at this institution, got his first C, and was like, oh, that means I don't belong here. Little did he know how many of us freshman year get our first C's in various classes. So this idea that somehow you don't belong in that space, and being able to seek out people who you can trust and who you can relate to. We see that in companies as well, that there are young people of ours who go through the competitive banking interviews or management consulting interviews or so forth, and very often the hiring practices or the expectations around the skills that you talked about a little bit, Rich, like you're judged on your handshake, you're judged on the quality of your thank you email, you're judged on the way you hold your fork. These kind of professional skills, soft skills, we should really be calling them essential skills that you learn when you come from a privileged background. My mother used to sit me down and make me write a thank you note every time I got a gift. And let me tell you, that's been a great benefit to me as a fundraiser, knowing now that I thank every single donor who comes my way. But for young people who do not, whose parents never went to college or don't work in professional spaces, and then all of a sudden being in these environments when they're judged according to criteria and this inside baseball that they're never taught. Right, so I think mentorship plays a key role there to combat imposter syndrome.
Mm-hmm. And I think it also goes the other way too, because I can reflect back on a conversation I had with a young African-American kid who was leaving the bank, and we spent a lot of time trying to recruit talent, so I always wanted to know why. And his response was, I know everything I do can't be that good, and yet I never get negative feedback. And I see the analysts around me are constantly being criticized, and I feel like I'm being robbed of the opportunity to succeed because I'm not learning the same way. And I thought that was quite interesting because people do tend to treat difference oftentimes with kid gloves. Right. And I know, David, one of the things that's nice about being at the beginning of something is you can try different things and see how they fit. I know you're looking at empathy and the role of empathy exchange. So tell us a little bit about that because it's interesting.
So we begin all of our programming with civic leaders around, there are 4 steps to it, but the first step is personal narrative. The second step is issue mapping, then power mapping, then asset inventory. The personal narrative begins essentially, and we learned this from a wonderful group called Narrative 4. And essentially you have people who have never met each other and they sit knee to knee. I tell you my story of why. I tell you the story of how my mother was a Portuguese immigrant and was working in a factory in Taunton, Massachusetts. Someone cut a corner on the machine, it malfunctioned, and all of a sudden the 23-year-old woman lost fingers on her hand immediately. And the hope and aspiration that an immigrant has in the blink of an eye turns into something other. I tell you that. You then tell me your story of why. I then stand up in front of the cohort of 20 and I tell your story in the first person. The listening that's required, the responsibility that people take from then conveying that story with a real deep sense of resonance and empathy and cognitive empathy, where you're putting yourself in the shoes of the person. And so no matter what stage of the civic engagement curriculum, and when we engage in a mentorship perspective that I do to this day, if I, as the CEO of the Obama Foundation, who had the great honor of working in that wonderful building, have an intern come in, she and I will engage in an empathy exchange where I have to stand up in front of people and be her. And when you do it, you find these amazing connections that have an almost instantaneous effect of not just connecting you to another human being, but also beginning to whittle away the power dynamics that can be very inhibitive of developing that kind of personal, professional connection that then becomes the gateway to everything else. It's I would urge everyone to try that, and to do it with someone who you believe you fundamentally disagree with, especially in today's era. To just find that person because you will see immediately that the things that actually bring us together are much deeper and many more than those things that keep us apart. So that's the way we begin then.
No, that's great. It's very powerful. Kevin, when you are thinking as an investor, I think one of the things that is missing often is transparency around things like diversity. So you have an ability, because you're going to mete out capital, to make that a principle that you want to hear about. So tell us, is that something that you think about? Should investors be thinking about that as demography changes?
You know, this is a huge issue. I obviously invest in large public entities, as well as small private companies. And diversity, let's take a board in a public company. There's a concern that boards would err towards diversity as opposed to performance. And that's a huge mistake, to put somebody in a seat because you're thinking that you're swaying to political pressure, and you're providing an optic that is somehow solving that problem. It doesn't have to be that way at all. It's a dirty secret in my view, and I've tested this theory with plenty of boards where I get a chance to interact with them. Why is this particular person on this board? What experience do they bring to solve for the shareholder? And can you as a shareholder, can I ask you this question? And I want you to be transparent with me. And luckily, I can say now that most boards understand we don't need even government regulation anymore to force diversity onto corporate boards. They totally get it. But what's different in the last 2 years, I would say, is they're demanding a tremendous amount of performance metrics, because most of the time these large entities use consultants to find these individuals, to vet them, to bring them forward as candidates, which is a good thing because they have a huge database of them. But now, if you talk to these consultants, and usually this is all off the record, they're never going to email you this answer. They really give a damn about performance because they know they're going to get scrutinized by it. And I think the new generation of diversity, whether it be ethnic or gender, is based on giving that opportunity to a man or woman that really can contribute to that board, as opposed to mandating it because they feel political pressure. I think that's the good news in America. Now, the way it manifests itself in a small business is, and I'll just be frank about this, my results as an investor in small private companies, 95% of my returns in a decade in all of these tiny companies of 5 and 10 million in sales have all come from companies run by women. So I'm extremely biased now, almost to it's probably a problem because I don't do a lot of deals with men in startups anymore because they don't deliver any results. And this is a horrible problem.
Right. It's because women feel they have to work twice as hard.
There may be, we're trying to figure out what they're doing because clearly we could use that information.
You have to multitask at all times.
You know that old adage, you want something done, give it to a busy mother. It may be time allocation, they may set goals that mitigate risk. Whatever it is, the results are stunning. They're just stunning. And if you just look at, we have all the data over a decade. It's remarkable performance. And so I'm not worried about diversity in my portfolio. It's way skewed, and I'm going to get criticized for not going in the, in a balanced portfolio, but it's my money and I'll cry if I want to. That's the way I look at it.
So, no, I think that's a great stat. And actually, there is demonstrable evidence across public companies that those with more diverse boards actually deliver better financial performance. So it makes all the sense in the world. Joel, I want to go back to something that Beth said. Often, what these kids are missing is not their academic training, because they're pretty smart, but it's those other things, like the non-business style. So what do you think over your career? I mean, when you are, as a senior person, I'm sure people come to you for advice. What advice do you give them, besides the traditional stuff of doing what you love and climbing up the ladder, but are there things that are not related to business that you think are important for people to know?
Well, most of the counseling that I give to my students is one-on-one. is them coming in and saying, I'm not getting along with my roommate, or I'm breaking up with my boyfriend, or how do you handle this, that, or the other. And they may just not have the social skills to do that. And that's, I think, where one-on-one mentoring can be helpful. I would like to make a comment about this diversity issue, because I've come to think about it in a way that has really helped me, and I use the symphony orchestra as a model. You know, none of us would like a symphony that's all oboes. You know, if there's nothing but oboes, it would just destroy Beethoven's Fifth. So if you have a diversity of instruments, you get all these timbres and all this subtlety, and it's really much more beautiful. But imagine a symphony orchestra where everybody were playing from a diverse piece of music, a different piece of music. That's actually that piece of music you hear at the beginning of every concert, where everybody's just playing nothing. So there's a sharing of objectives that's really important. You don't want to have diverse objectives, whatever. You want to have diverse talent, skills, abilities. I really agree with what you said about really going for competence, but then you find it in all flavors, and then the orchestra is much more beautiful. So that wasn't on your question at all, but I just felt like I wanted to give that example because it's helped me sort through building boards over the years.
Good. And David, let's stay on this theme, because I know between Global Girls Alliance and My Brother's Keeper, you're targeting communities of color oftentimes.
Right.
How, without role models in senior-most positions, although the president obviously being one, how do you match people? And what's been the feedback so far from both ends?
So we begin with a notion that a young man from Boston, I think, influenced this by saying, nothing about us without us. The former president, has echoed this also when he said that whatever success he had as an organizer was when he went into a community and didn't tell them what he thought they needed, but actually listened to them in terms of what they needed and then helped them see the capacity they already had and then facilitated. So one program that we have, and I mentioned this before, is called the Community Leadership Corps. We begin with 50 young people on the south side of Chicago, west side of Chicago, a third African American, a third Hispanic, some Asian American Pacific Islanders, some white. They come together, and essentially from that, we will pick 3 or 4 who will be the peer leaders. They lead. They then become the anchors for what's happening on a week-to-week, month-to-month basis. It isn't me or someone else saying this is what you need. It's essentially they're seeing people who come from their experience, who look like them, who become exemplars. And so there's a month of that, and then we connect them with organizations throughout the city who also have leadership that looks like them. And so all of a sudden, 4 or 5 months later, you have, no matter the background, a young person who says, 1, I have the capacity to do something I didn't imagine I could before, even if it's organizing people to clean up a park in the neighborhood. You have a responsibility, you do it. Don't wait for anybody else. The second thing they say is that there are people like me who are actually leading. The third thing that as a son of an immigrant was enormously powerful. You are constrained by what you see immediately in front of you. And it takes someone to lift you up and to show you what you didn't think was possible or imaginable. And when it's done by someone from your community, from your background with a shared experience, all of a sudden, you have these 19 and 20-year-olds who aren't viewing leadership just from an activist perspective. They're viewing themselves truly embodied as a citizen with a responsibility in their community, not just to themselves, but to others. And so it has to be a very deliberate and thoughtful recognition of, in some ways, the psychological, sociological limitations that people feel. And how do you deconstruct that in a way that they can see themselves in this moment of power? It is a joyful thing to watch. Yeah.
That's great. Beth, how do I get a mentor? Like, I'm sure once you're tracking these kids as they get out of school, if they enter the workplace, how do I get one?
For our students, you're
Yeah.
asking? So you have no choice. That's what we say at LIDA. So we have mentorship at several different stages. So when students are first thinking about applying to college, for example, most of them coming from really under-resourced public schools where the college counselor offers them usually 3 choices. Here's your local community college, here's your local state college, and here's the military. I mean, that is really the state of college advising in some of these big public schools. So when the students come and spend 7 weeks with us at our summer institute, we have a team of older LIDA scholars who are in college or who have graduated. And so they can see, as David said, I mean, what we say, I think I stole this from Marion Wright Edelman, you cannot dream what you cannot see. Yeah. So when you see someone standing in front of you who's now a lawyer, who went to Stanford, comes from a similar background and so forth, all of a sudden your whole concept of what is possible for your life changes. So we kind of force mentorship, from that early stage. When our students get to college, they're matched with an older peer mentor. Not someone who tells them, what time the library closes, but tells them, you know what, when you get that first C, you go set up an appointment with your professor. And if you don't, the professor's going to think that you don't give a hoot, right? Who would know that? Our students say, the only reason we ever went to the principal's office in my school is when we got in trouble. Why would I go see my professor? I'm not in trouble, right? And not understanding that that's a commodity that you need. And then also in our career programming, we engage our older students who are in these different companies to come in and talk about their professional experience. And now turning this into a whole alumni network of first-gen low-income students who will mentor our younger students. And I think there's a lot of opportunities there. But I would say that I think it's important for companies who are truly committed to engaging and nurturing diverse talent that mentoring be a fundamental component. And students and young people shouldn't have to seek out mentors themselves when they get to companies. It shouldn't just be one more thing you have to do. It should be something that's part of the onboarding process.
Mm-hmm. How many companies have you invested in or that you know that actually have a formal program, to Beth's point, that doesn't task the new employee, but really embraces them with a mentor?
You'd be surprised that the majority of companies that get past 5 million in sales, which is tiny, start to think about this. Because I think a lot of people in America don't realize how difficult it is to hire people right now. It is virtually impossible. We are at full employment measured by my challenge to employ people in almost every state in these small private startups. I've never seen anything like this. I mean, this is a remarkable situation where this is almost a release valve to bring in an intern or a mentorship program just to get anybody to help you grow your business, because something is going on out there that's rather interesting. And I'm talking about towns like Champaign-Urbana, Amarillo, Texas, Fargo. If you're expanding a business in Fargo, let's take Fargo. I have a company there called PRX, which is doing phenomenally well. They need a social media person. They need somebody that can reach out and lower customer acquisition costs. Try and find a social media expert in Fargo.
We have scholars from Fargo.
But that's the point. They have reached out to the college, and they are, and I'm telling every dean, including on the side of arts, start training people that understand how to tell stories on the internet. I don't care if you do it in your arts department or you do it in your business department. We need people that can reach out directly on social media platforms, that understand how those platforms work, that understand the algorithms, that know how to work directly with those platforms. And we need them now, like now, because that company in Fargo sells internationally. It's competing with Chinese guys knocking it off. So I want the deal. I want to get that IP thing set up, because we're always suing these people all the time that are stealing our stuff, and I'm tired of it. But those foreign companies are using American social media so effectively. Forget about rigging elections. They're stealing marketing. And they're really, really, really good at it, because in China, they're training 280,000 engineers a year with social media talent. We don't do that. That really pisses me off. I mean, we got to get in the game here. We got to start understanding what's going on internationally. And we're reaching out to colleges now to hire. America's at full employment. We're on fire, but with not enough people. That's what's going on right now.
Okay, so I want to pivot to another issue, which is that in the wake of Me Too, there has been a significant pushback from senior men inside corporations willing to take on junior women as mentees. And I think that this is something that we have to figure out, because you can't skew the process towards the aberrant behavior at the expense of not giving people opportunity to have mentors. So we'd love to, Joel, let's start with you. I'd like your perspective on that.
'Cause I'm the most senior man.
Say again?
Because I'm the most senior.
No, because you're on my left. But it's, you know, I just want to, I think it's something that we need to talk about, because it comes up quite frequently in this context of mentorship. And you would hate to, all the progress that we've had, to all of a sudden rob people of opportunity. So how do you think about it?
Well, it is on the mind of a lot of CEOs. So I know a lot of CEOs and a lot of chairmen. With the Me Too movement, a lot of them are nervous about it, and understandably so. By the way, I have a lot of young co-eds that come into my office at Stanford. And I even asked Stanford if I could put a camera in the office, just so I could feel safe. And it was against policy. They wouldn't allow a camera in the office. So now I just make sure the door is ajar. And so I think you do have to be aware of it. It's a real thing, and it's something that is on the minds of men. And so I think you have to be careful. But that it isn't fair to my young co-eds, my female students, not to spend the same time with them that I would with a young man. So I just make sure. Often I'll do it with two of them there, or I'll do it with the door ajar. The only awkward experience, I'll tell you a funny story that's a little off point, but the only really awkward experience I ever had was with a Saudi student that I had that had a problem with stuttering. And I worked with him for over 2 years while he was at the business school. And when he was getting ready to graduate, he came to my office and he said, "Would you mind if I kissed you on the forehead?" And I thought, oh my gosh, is anybody looking? I remember checking around and everything. Then I leaned down and he kissed me on the forehead. I've learned from my Saudi friends that that's a wonderful thing to happen. I haven't yet had any of my female students want to kiss me on the forehead or anywhere else, but I'm very aware. I mean, I think about it. Mm-hmm. I'm just aware of it.
I don't think that most people entering that situation are expecting any untoward behavior on either side. So, but it definitely has been elevated in the public consciousness. Kevin, do you have any thoughts on that?
There is only one solution. It was hinted to, and I'm very interested in the outcome of that camera discussion. We have implemented it in 4 companies now. And here's what we did. And I know we're going to hear it right now. But this you can't have it. There's zero tolerance for this issue. And it's very unproductive anyways, and it's really bad for morale. And when the only solution is to put a digital camera in every single office, which is what we've done, I've endorsed it for our own office by going to each one of our employees and saying, look, we have a lot of people come through here. We have all kinds of young people coming through here every day. And, you know, we need to do this for, and disclose it to everybody. Let's put a camera in there's some great technology now where you can put it on your desk and you can actually use it to communicate with other people on other floors, immediately be with them, and know with certainty that you are never alone. But many young people today are used to that. It doesn't have the same visceral feel that it does to somebody my age. And we don't have any problems anymore. The server backs up for 90 days. You can back it up longer if you wish. Every single room, day and night, with audio. I can look at it right now if there's an incident. I can go right to the tape and see it. And we have gone from issues, you know, various, when you put a lot of young people together in their 20s, stuff happens. That's nature.
College.
It's just, that's what happens. And if you have a zero tolerance policy, you simply say, it's not going to happen in this office. You know, you make your personal decisions outside of these walls, that's one thing. But in this office, there's zero tolerance, and here's why. And it's worked. It has 100% effective. But you have no privacy. So if you're going to call your wife and get in an argument with her, you got to go outside. It's like smoking. So I know people are having issues when they're sitting out on their cell phone downstairs. I can look out the window and see a bunch of people. They're not smoking. They're talking. And that is what I think is going to become more and more and more what happens. Educational institutions will not do it. I'm aware of that. Government institutions won't do it. I'm aware of that. But the private sector is going to embrace this because it works.
Okay, I'm not sure if cameras in every office are the exact solution, but it's it's an issue, and I think that it continues to isolate the very people we're trying to incorporate into the workflow. So if you think back years ago when there were golf outings where guys would go out drinking and women were excluded from those activities, and those experiences actually turbocharge one's career. I think you're robbing them of that is not going to be helpful. David, in the government, from where you just came, how does this issue play out there on the cross-gender mentoring?
So, I can only speak to my experience serving in the Obama White House, where in the final 2 years, the senior table, of which I had the great honor of sitting at, was more than half women. And from the beginning, both from the president and Mrs. Obama, there was an expectation of holding ourselves to the highest ethical standard. And the expectation that we weren't just doing a job, we were serving the American people, and you had to do it in a way that was consistent with what we would expect them to be. And a lot of the discussion is around diversity and inclusion, but there is a broader discussion that goes, I think, to the heart of this, which is equity. Building into a culture that I believe we had in the West Wing, that we are incorporating at the Obama Foundation, which says that when you think about power dynamics, because at the end of the day, this is what this is about, is power. And you need to make sure that the values on the wall aren't just the result of a wonderful study that someone did with a whole bunch of consultants, but your interview process is rooted in those values. Your onboarding is rooted in those values. Your all staff is rooted in those values. And that's beyond a zero tolerance. It's essentially the flip side. Here is the expectation of the way that you behave. Because one thing that I convey to the rest of the team is that when you are working for any organization, and for me I'm working for an organization that represents a former president and a former first lady, it isn't just the way you show up at work, but it's also the way you show up in your community, where you are expected to behave in a certain way. And if you deviate from that, then you are violating the core values of who we are, and you are behaving in an inequitable way. Do people have their frailties? Yes. But at the end of the day, this is about power and the understanding that mostly men have to understand that as Mrs. Obama would say, be better. That in an organization, in an economy, and in a world where questions of equity just mean that women isn't just having a seat at the table. It's not just a spot, but a leadership responsibility. And so we have to be very, very mindful of, even as we try to mitigate against or deal with this era, that we don't lose track of what's really driving this. It is a power dynamic that frankly needs to change. And organizations need to be mindful of that from the beginning and live those values from beginning to end. So that's the way we dealt with it and are now.
Okay. So this panel is on mentors. I'd like to hear from each of the panelists about a mentor that was impactful to you and what you learned about yourself from that person. So why don't we start? We'll start with you, because you're ready to go.
In my first business that I started coming out of college was a production company to serve the NHL for programming. Bobby Orr and the Hockey Legends, Gump Worsley, various, the original six, these were television formats. And I was really struggling to be an operator for the first time, and I had a partner named Jerry Paston, who's passed away a long time ago. He was an agent that brought some of the first Russian players into the league in Detroit and some of the original six teams. And he was an amazing mentor in the sense that he could see the frustration I was having dealing with all the inbound stuff that happens when you're a young entrepreneur. You're trying to solve so many problems, and this is where people fail. And I've learned this myself over time. But he used to sit me down and say, you know, Kevin, it's all noise. It's just all noise. All this is noise. You got to set a goal, make it on a weekly basis, and everything else just doesn't matter. It sounds so trite now, but it was so powerful in those days. And it really set me free. And I probably too much so, because I don't care about criticism anymore. It's a horrible disease. I set a goal, and I just go do it. And if I've done it fairly and I achieve it, I feel I've done the right thing for the people in the organization. And I teach my young, great entrepreneurs, you have to have a certain amount of Teflon built into your skin, because you're going to get criticized like hell. And it's just noise. Those were Jerry's words. I'll never forget them.
That's great. Beth?
So I have spent my whole career working with young people, the juvenile justice system, New York City public schools, or so forth. And there was a woman in the New York City public school system from whom I really just learned what has been the essence of my career, which is that the kids must just come first. And you can work in a big bureaucracy, you can work in a nonprofit, you can work in government, but you have to support young people one kid at a time. And she was bold, and she was brazen, and she was unapologetic, and it sometimes took longer. And to push back a little bit on the scale question, mentoring young people is not a virtual activity. It's the core of youth development research is you just work with them individually. And she, I think, pushed me to be bold enough to want to do that with my career. And once again, it may slow you down. It may require calls on the weekends or so forth. But if you're really going to invest in young people, you have to put them first and put the elbow grease in. And so she was really transformative for me, and she was fearless, and she was hilarious, and she was fierce. So.
Joel?
So I'm going to violate your definition of mentor.
Okay.
Can I do that?
It's pretty loose.
Yeah. Because this is somebody I was unable to go to and get counsel from. But for me, Winston Churchill has been a mentor. And I have a picture. I don't know if you know in fact, I know you do know this picture that Yusuf Karsh, the Armenian-Canadian photographer, took of Churchill, where he's glowering and has this really firm view in the midst of World War II. In fact, the picture was taken in December of 1941, right after Pearl Harbor happened, and he'd gone up to Canada to speak to Parliament. So I have one of the originals of that picture framed in my office, and I hang it on the wall. And I've had to do a bunch of turnarounds in my life and deal with setbacks and things that have been hard. And I look at Churchill, and I think, boy, if he could do what he did during that period, he saved the Western world during that period of time. He had his foibles. My gosh, the guy was a flawed character in so many ways, but he has been an amazing inspiration to me and somebody that I've been able to reference and has helped me out of the ditch on more than one occasion.
All right, David, it's not really fair if you say Barack Obama.
I won't.
But so, all right, who else is your mentor, and what'd you learn?
Before I worked for President Obama, I worked for the governor of Massachusetts, a man named Deval Patrick. And I remember we would go into the meetings in the governor's office, and we would present him with all kinds of different challenging issues. And he would say, let's begin with the right thing to do and work backwards from there. And it was all anchored in this view of that every day walking into work, I repeated the same mantra on the way in and the way out. Remember who you are and who you represent. Because you get in these positions, and sometimes the greatest, and Kevin was referencing it in some ways about the noise, the greatest inhibitor for people is when you begin to believe your own nonsense. Or you begin to believe the nonsense that other people ascribe to you. And so to remember that wherever we go in life and whatever we achieve, we need to have that anchor around what we believe. And know that if you're sitting in a room, whether it's in a boardroom, or if you're mentoring a young man or young woman, that you have a responsibility to them because someone opened up doors for you. None of us, no matter how successful or brilliant, are fully formed individuals who are where you are because of your transcendent brilliance. No one. you stand on the shoulders of others and you have a responsibility to make sure that you have other people standing on yours. In the years working for him, he just embodied that in a way to, Joel, what you were saying before about show, don't tell, was perhaps the best lesson that I ever had. So.
Great. All right, we have about 5 minutes left. I thought I'd take this time to open it up to any questions in the audience. Yes, right here. I think is there a microphone in the room? Yes, one's coming, I think.
Hi.
It's on.
Hi. This question's for Joel. Joel, I'll start with a confession I have. Over 20 years ago, as freshly minted out of MBA school and at DLJ, you said to me, I'm going to give you my account because I think you'll treat me like your only client. And I think you knew at the time, but I'll confess you were my only client. And so that created the spark in my life. Everybody, I'm sure, was vying for your business, and for you to give that to a freshly minted MBA was the act of doing, not telling. And I guess my question is, how do you continue to inspire that, and how do you continue to build the mentors, and what are some other ways that can inspire us to become better mentors, and what role will the one-on-one evolve with technology?
So what I do is I imagine the potential in people. I just envision them where they might be. I love potential, and I believe that if you empower other people, they will almost never let you down. They will do whatever they can to not disappoint you. And so I think a lot of people think that if I give up power to others, it will reduce my power. My experience is that it increases the power of the organization, the power of others, and you are, in effect, mentoring when you're doing that. You're not realizing it, but the more broadly you can have a life that empowers others, the more you're mentoring people. You're mentoring people you don't even know.
Okay, we have one more question maybe. Yes, sir.
So first I want to thank you for this hour. It's actually been very inspirational for me. Got a question for you, and that is to anybody that's on the panel. The responsibilities and relationship that you have with your mentees, do you actually have written goals for them, or do you establish written goals? If you do, why? If you don't, why not?
I don't write written notes, I video them. I take my iPhone
You're
out.
big on video.
Yeah, I am. I basically say...
Is one of your investments a camera company?
Well, it's where I came from. I used to be a cameraman and an editor. But let's say we just had a meeting, we agreed that we were going to achieve something in the next 6 weeks. They leave the office, it's fresh on my mind, the session we just had, and I pull the camera out and I say, you know, Joel, you said you could get this done in 6 weeks. I'm watching you. And if you have problems, just click on this link and remember I'm watching you. You can come back and we'll talk about it again. But it's 6 weeks, and that's the date. That's far more effective than an email.
What does Joel say?
I've got these, they're all over the place, these videos. There's little 30-second Kevin O'Leary videos. They're very interesting because it's a long record of your relationship on what you had in that conversation. I believe in mentoring has to be, together. You got to be in a room together alone. I don't believe in videotaping it or in terms of that. You have to be interacting, but then once you know the goal, you formalize it in a format that every young person knows today. Video.
So one of the things I used to do is make sure, because I think one of the ways that you mentor people is by giving them feedback. So little is told people that is honest and direct and clear and specific. And I think if you really want to help somebody, you give them feedback in a high-trust environment. So I always say feedback is the breakfast of champions. And I used to coach the CEO at JetBlue. Every Saturday morning I had a 1-hour conversation with him. And he would stop me every once in a while and he'd say, are we getting ready to have some breakfast? And because he knew that there was feedback coming. But it can be fun. It can actually be fun. And I think any of us who has been mentored, we have to embrace negative feedback. You have to reward people who give you feedback that's negative. That way you'll ensure that you'll get the mentorship that you need. So a lot of people are defensive. They hear something that's negative and they're defensive. Just disabuse yourself of that notion and just thank people for the negative feedback. Tell me more. Am I really understanding this, you know?
Great. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank our panelists. I want to task all of you with doing something. I assume that when I asked the panelists to reflect on a mentor that had been impactful to them, that each of you conjured up someone. I would suggest, as this gentleman led by example, reach out to them today via email or a call and thank them. And I don't think we do that often enough, and I think this will spur us towards that today. Thank you very much.